is evidence of an intelligent mind. That's not a mind of the gaps. It's the only thing that makes sense.
Dr. John Lennox continually taking away excuses from atheists for not believing in God. In this particular case, he addresses a few things, but notably the God of the gaps fallacy. Make sure to stick around to see what he says, and especially wait until the end, where I can kind of bring this down to a layman's understanding of things.
Which is the God of the gaps. Now, I'm allergic to this in the sense that I do not want people to think that I believe in a God of the gaps. So how do I deal with it? Well, in several different ways. I'm going to go for the easiest one. And it's this, that think of Isaac Newton and his wonderful law of gravitation. And I used to love explaining it to students, how you get an equation with 8 symbols in it, and from it you could deduce the motion of the planets around the sun. It is just brilliant stuff. Now, when Newton discovered that, did he think, right, I have now got an equation that allows me to deduce the motion of the planets from it. I don't need God. No, he didn't. He wrote what was perhaps the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, and he dedicated it to with the hope that thinking people would see in it evidence for the existence of a divine intelligence behind the universe. Because his argument was this: I found this wonderful mathematical description of what goes on in between heavy bodies and how they move. What a brilliant God who did it that way. And it's exactly that in the way we normally think. If you know a lot about painting, you will see much more in a Rembrandt picture than I would, who am pretty ignorant about art, although I like it. You can see the genius. If you're an engineer, you'll see much more in a Rolls-Royce engine than I possibly would, because you see the evidence. And to my mind, God is not a God of the gaps. He is the most powerful explanatory power to make sense of the whole thing. I'm a mathematician. The very fact that we can do mathematics, to me, is an indicator that this is a word-based universe, to put it that way. The very fact that in biology we've discovered the longest word, the human genome, 3.4 billion letters in the chemical alphabet, is evidence of an intelligent mind. That's not a mind of the gaps. It's the only thing that makes sense. Now, I'm looking around the room, but the lights are blinding me. Oh yes, I see a word up there, prayer. How very suitable. There are 2, 4, 6 letters. The moment you see that, what do you deduce? Well, you can see letters. They have meaning to you. You cannot explain that meaning in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and paint there. But the moment you see that, there are many mechanical processes that went in producing that sign. But you know, because that carries meaning, it's a word, that behind it there was a mind. Not a mind of the gaps, but a mind that's the only sensible explanation of what you're reading up there. It's that kind of argument, to my mind, that I find extremely convincing.
Richard and Ogden published this book in 1923, 100 years ago, called The Meaning of Meaning.
Yes.
And it's a very popular book, and they talked about how language influences thought and affects thought. And they devised the semantic triangle, which is a model of meaning, and you have the symbol or the sign, linguistic sign, on one side. You have the actual thing in reality on the other side, which is the referent. And then you have at the top thought. And it's the relation and the causal relation and interactions of these three that give you meaning. This book actually was very influential in philosophy and also influenced C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, published in 1943, in which he talked about objective moral standards and also natural law. So people and scientists sometimes say, look, there's this universe out there with millions of galaxies, with hundreds of thousands of stars, and they all dance together in a very interesting, in a beautiful rhythm because of the gravity law. But there is no meaning to that. And also, as a human being, which is, as humans, this is a microcosm. There's no meaning in our life either. Does meaning imply intelligent design?
It's interesting that people should even say a thing like that. There is no meaning in it. And they expect me to understand the meaning of that statement. It's one of these incoherent things that people make statements and they are unconsciously accepting themselves. It's like, may I tell a little story?
Please do.
Sitting in my Oxford College beside a man who had a book, and he was putting it on the table, and I could see its title was curious, about semantics and so on. I said, what's your book about? Well, he said, this is a book that shows that there's no such thing as authorial intention. I said, pardon? I said, you mean if I read your book, I will understand that an author has no intention? He said, exactly. So I said, I'm not going to read it. So he said, why not? Well, I said, it must apply to your book as well. Well, he'd never thought about it. He got very angry and he got up and walked out. We never saw him again. This is one of the weaknesses of this sort of loose postmodern style talk that says there's no such thing as truth, but they expect you to believe that statement as a truth. It goes too far. It goes right over the top. Now, I'm very interested in the kind of way in which you pose that question, because another person that influenced Lewis a lot, one of his inklings, was Barfield. And Owen Barfield posed an interesting question. He said, why is it we live in a world where we understand how almost everything works and we know the meaning of nothing? Ian McGilchrist is a very interesting, he's a polymath really, he's a neuroscientist, but roughly speaking, he's been working on something we're all familiar with. When we say, Jane, you know, she's a real left-brained nerd, always into computers and all this kind of thing. Whereas James, well, he's so right-brained with his head in arts and the clouds and so on. Left and right brain. Well, what Ian McGilchrist claims in his very interesting book, which is called, this is a very interesting title, The Matter with Things, is that there is substance to these differences between the two brain hemispheres. And roughly speaking, both brain hemispheres are involved in virtually every event in our brains and minds, but the differences are that indeed there is this concentration in the left brain on rational thought, on analysis, on breaking things down, whereas the right brain concerns itself much more with putting things into context and meaning. And he says this, for the last 400 or 500 years, we have neglected the right brain, so that we're living in a world where we know how most things work, but we understand the meaning of nothing. And when our late chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, read that, he had a light bulb moment. And he wrote a book because of it, a very interesting book called The Great Partnership. But he put it this way, and I like this formulation, it's very helpful. He said, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And it seems to me that that captures something extremely important, that we need to focus on the meaning side, because science is powerful precisely because it limits the questions it can answer. It cannot give us meaning and it cannot give us value. Einstein saw that years ago. He said you could talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. You have to look outside. And I always cite one of Richard Dawkins' favorite scientists, Sir Peter Medawar, who said it's so easy to see, and this is hugely important because science is so powerful. It's so easy to see, he wrote, that science is limited because it cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going, and what is the meaning of life? And to answer those questions, we need to go to literature, and I would add, well, he added philosophy, and I would add theology and a lot of other things as well. Because the fatal flaw in much so-called academic thinking is that people have come to believe that science is coextensive with rationality, which is nonsense. History is a rational discipline, so is theology, so is economics, but they're not the natural sciences. If science and rationality were coextensive, you'd have to close half the departments in every university in the United Kingdom. So that's how I'd begin to approach your question.
I love all the comments I get on the videos I do. I'm eager to help facilitate conversation about these topics because I think they're important. And sometimes, depending on the video, the comments are filled with people who are more atheist or agnostic leaning, making claims, and the top claim always being that theists are believing some sort of God of the gaps theory or belief system. Those comments are usually especially eager to accuse the intellectual theists like Dr. John Lennox of believing this, of believing God of the gaps. But nothing could be further from the truth. Listen, if you're going to critique someone's view of something, you have to critique their view, not your interpretation of their view, which may or may not be accurate. Doing anything else is basically erecting straw men. It's akin to what was said in Don Quixote in Chasing Windmills, or like they say in Ecclesiastes, chasing the wind. It's a futile effort that doesn't actually solve anything. I mean, attacking a belief that somebody doesn't actually hold is just such a waste of time. A God of the gaps is not something that most Christians, and especially the intellectual theists, believe in. They don't sit there and say,
"Wow, we ain't got no explanation for this. God must have done it."
Sorry to my Southern American friends. Couldn't help but emulate the accent. I love you guys. Truly I do. It is the exact opposite. It is these intellectual theists going, look at this mountain of evidence. It is pointing towards God, not saying there's a lack of evidence, so God must have done it. I hope you're understanding the difference between the two. Now, if someone says, look at this evidence, it's pointing towards God, you may not agree. You may think that that evidence actually points towards atheism. That's fair. That's a separate discussion, and if that's what you believe, you need to present your argument as to why that evidence points towards atheism, while the theist can say why that evidence points towards God. But it's not a God of the gaps, believing that a lack of evidence means God. If there was one straw man I would love to see gone from the conversations between theists and atheists, it would be that God of the gaps view that atheists tend to put on theists. And I think Dr. John Lennox here addresses that problem really well. Secondly, there was such an important point made at the end of this video here. Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson recently had a conversation, and throughout that conversation, Richard Dawkins pointed out or insinuated several times that it seems like Dr. Jordan Peterson was more interested in symbols, while Dr. Richard Dawkins claimed that he's more interested in facts and real things. And near the end of the conversation, the host, Alex O'Connor, posed a question to Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Well, why is it that there is no... I mean, they say that God meets you where you're at, right? And there are some people who just care about scientific truth. That's what they know, that's their profession.
Well,
why is there not anything in the Bible for them?
Now, there's a whole other tangent there I might like to go down one time, if you would like to see this, talking about how faith and religion has actually facilitated the sciences and helped the scientific practice. If you'd like to see that video, comment down below. After you subscribe to this channel, of course. But the simple answer to Alex O'Connor's question is this: because the Bible is not a scientific textbook. The question is a little bit akin to saying,
Why can't you use a boat to go flying?
did you seriously just ask me that? Science can tell you how a child's legs work in order to walk them to school every day. Science cannot tell you why that child is walking to school every day. For deeper questions and answers to those questions, we need to look out of science for these ultimate truths. I am such a huge fan of the sciences and the scientific process. In another life, I might have been a scientist in a lab somewhere. I'm definitely not. But science generally only gets at the how, not at the why. The answer to that lies almost exclusively outside of the scientific realm. Is there a topic you want to see covered or something within this video you want to see delved into deeper? Let me know down below in the comments and check this video out to see why science doesn't hold the answer to everything.